Gertrude was the 18-year-old daughter and the only child of Mr. and Mrs. Wentworth. She was an attractive girl with smooth skin, pretty features, and a pleasant physique. Her parents were very shocked when she came down to breakfast one morning and announced that she was getting married. After all, she had only just finished school. The object of her affections was a young man named Walter. He was 20 years old and quite handsome and athletic. Gertrude had met him at a football game and took an immediate shine to him. When her parents tried to talk her out of marriage, Gertrude brushed off their concerns and assured them that everything would be fine. She said Walter had recently inherited a large sum of money from his uncle. Gertrude found a rich man very attractive, and she was eager to help him spend it. No matter how hard they tried, her parents were unable to change her mind. Gertrude was soon showing off her new diamond engagement ring and telling her parents that the wedding would take place in 3 months' time. She invited Walter over to the house to meet her parents. Mr. and Mrs. Wentworth were anxious to find out all about him. He appeared to be a nice and decent young man and seemed so utterly devoted to Gertrude that her parents began to warm to the idea of the marriage. When they found out exactly how much money he had inherited, they became even more enthusiastic and invited Walter to stay with them for a few days. However, that very evening, Gertrude began to feel very tired and exhausted. The next day, in the middle of dinner, she burst into tears for no apparent reason. A day after that, she suddenly started shaking and ran up to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. She refused to talk to anyone, but Walter finally managed to coax her out. She eventually broke down and told her parents what was going on. She was suffering from a recurring nightmare that was driving her crazy. "It always starts the same way," she whined. "In the dream, I'm standing in a room. In the corner, there's a big bed lying on it. A ugly old man with a long grey beard. He begins writhing as if he's in a lot of pain. Then all of a sudden, he rolls over and falls off the bed. He lands in a black coffin." "Good Lord," said the mother. "That is very odd indeed." Walter went pale. Every detail of Gertrude's nightmare seemed to make him more and more distressed. "That's when it happens," Gertrude continued. "As I watch in horror, cracks start appearing in the coffin, and I can see big clumps of long grey hair streaming through them. The hair creeps over the lid and completely engulfs the coffin. It starts moving towards me, slithering across the floor like a gigantic woolly snake. Then the room is suddenly plunged into darkness and I can feel something spreading across my face. It's the grey hair. It starts wrapping itself around my head, forcing itself down my throat, suffocating me. I can't breathe, I can't see, I can't scream. It's horrible." "My God," cried Mr. Wentworth. "That's dreadful, you poor little girl. What a terrifying experience." "Yes," agreed Walter. "It's one of the most disgusting and unnerving dreams I've ever had of. It's so bad that I'm terrified to go to sleep at night," said Gertrude. "There must be some explanation for it." Just then, as Gertrude was absently staring down the window, a man with a grey beard happened to pass by on the street. She flew into hysterics and started screaming uncontrollably. Her parents tried to calm her down. That night, they decided that she shouldn't be left alone and asked Walter to watch over her. He stayed up all night, sitting by her bedside, listening to her snore. A little after midnight, Gertrude suddenly sat up in bed and started clawing at her face. It seemed like she was trying to free herself from something. Walter jumped out of his chair and started gently stroking her forehead. After a few minutes, she woke up. Her eyes were staring blankly, her body was trembling, and she burst into tears. Walter comforted her, speaking to her in soothing tones until she calmed down. Soon her sobbing subsided, and she fell into an exhausted sleep. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Wentworth were in the living room, watching TV, while Walter was outside washing their car and mowing their lawn. Gertrude was in the kitchen reading a book, when she felt something tickling her neck. At first she didn't pay any attention, but then she looked around. To her horror, she saw clumps of long, grey hair streaming out of the kitchen sink and coiling around her neck. She screamed. Walter came running into the kitchen, followed closely by Gertrude's parents. They found the poor girl sprawled on the floor. Her sweater was wrapped around her head, and her book lay on the ground beside her. Walter pulled back the sweater and was horrified to find Gertrude's face was almost completely white. She was unconscious. Her parents soaked a towel in water and put it over Gertrude's forehead. Together they carried her upstairs and lay her gently on her bed. She stayed there for the rest of the evening, slowly recovering. She thought she heard the sound of whispering and soft mutterings. Now and then there was a eerie snigger or a chuckle. They couldn't tell where the noises were coming from. The next day, she wasn't much better. She begged her mother to remove anything that was remotely grey from her room. She had also developed a terrible fear of hair, so much so that she asked Walter and her mother and father to wear scarves over their heads. Walter spent the entire day with her, chatting quietly to her and reassuring her. It was a full week before Gertrude was well enough to come downstairs. Even then, her eyes were gaunt, and she seemed to move around like a zombie. Gertrude's parents were very worried, and they decided that a short break might ease her nerves. That weekend, they brought their daughter to a holiday resort by the sea. Of course, they invited Walter to accompany them. At the hotel, Gertrude spoke very little and ignored everyone else. She spent her time sitting in a deck chair on the bench and staring out at the sea. However, the next morning she seemed much better. She came down to breakfast in her bikini and seemed eager to go down to the beach and take a swim. Walter was delighted, and together they walked down to the water's edge. The beach was crowded, and Walter jumped into the sea and swam around, encouraging his girlfriend to come in and join him. Gertrude began to step delicately into the water. She turned to wave her parents, who were lying on the beach, then walked forward again. The water had just reached her neck when she suddenly started screaming in terror. Her head disappeared beneath the waves. Walter swam furiously towards the spot where he had last seen her, dived down to look for her. As her parents watched from the beach, it seemed like an eternity until he appeared holding Gertrude in his arms. He dragged her to the shore and performed artificial respiration on her. After a while, she began coughing and threw up seawater. Walter helped her parents carry the girl back to their hotel room and sat by her beside her bed. The moment she recovered from consciousness, she stared at the ceiling with cold, vacant eyes and hissed, "There was someone in the water." "What? Who?" cried her father. "I put my foot on her face," Gertrude whispered. "I could feel it, and I felt the hair. It began to crawl up my legs and wrapped around me, pulling me down." Then she began to scream and scream and scream, and it took all of their strength to hold her down and stop her from hurting herself. Soon her struggles became less violent, and she passed out. An ambulance arrived to take her to the hospital. When they took his daughter away, Mr. Wentworth went back to his hotel room and lay down on his bed. His wife was weeping quietly in the bathroom. He was wondering what would become of this beautiful daughter he had. Just then, he happened to notice a small note lying on the floor. Picking it up, he discovered it was from Walter. "Dear Mr. Wentworth," it read, "when you read this, I'll already be dead. I finally made up my mind to end it all and drown myself. You see, I have a horrible secret that makes it impossible for me to marry your daughter, and without her, life would be unbearable. I have a confession to make. The fact is, I murdered my uncle. I poisoned him and made it look like he died from a heart attack. I was his only heir and he was going to leave his entire fortune to me. I couldn't wait until he died for natural causes. I killed him so I could collect the inheritance right now. I know now that it was a disgusting and despicable crime, but I felt like I had no choice. I wanted Gertrude to fall in love with me. I was sure she would never be interested in me unless I had a lot of money. Now I have gone and wrecked my life and hers. The moment I heard about Gertrude's nightmares, I knew what was going on. I am certain that her attacks will stop when I'm dead. Her sanity depends on what I am about to do. When she is well again, I'll just seem like a part of a horrible memory. With time, she'll forget me. You're probably very confused by now, but it will all make sense to you when I tell you this one fact. My uncle had long, grey hair. Mr. Wentworth immediately rushed to the phone and called the police, but it was too late. By the time they arrived, they found Walter floating face down in the ocean. The following day, Gertrude made a complete recovery. However, she never really got over the death of her beloved boyfriend, and she was left with a morbid fear of men with long, grey beards. Long ago, in my grandmother's time, the land was all in bogs, with great pools of black water and creeping trickles of green water and squishy mounds of earth that would suck you in if you stepped on them. Well, my grandmother used to say how in her time a young girl was once dead and buried in the ashes. If you want, I'll tell you all about it, just as she used to tell me. The moon above would shine and shine, and when it shone, it lit up all the bog pools, so you could walk about almost as safe as in the day. But when the moon didn't shine, then out came the things that dwell in the darkness, and they went about seeking to do evil and harm, and mischance and mischief to all that weren't safe at home by their fireplaces. Ghosts and ghouls and creeping terrors and crawling horrors, they all came out on nights when the moon didn't shine. Well, it so happened that a girl had to travel across the boglands one night. She was very troubled, because she had heard all the stories people told about the evil doings that transpired on the bogs. "I'll see for myself," she said. "Maybe it's not as bad as folks make it out." So, sure enough, that fateful night, out she stepped, wrapped up in a black cloak and with a black hood over her long blonde hair. She went straight to the bog's edge and looked about her. There was water here and water there, waving tufts of grass and trembling mounds of earth and great black snags, all twisted and bent. On she went, almost into the middle of the bogs, and looking about her, she could see queer things lurking in the darkness, grinning and grimacing at her as she passed. Evil eyes glowered from the darkness and the darkest of corners, and the wisps dance about with their lanterns swinging in the distance. But the moon shone brightly, and its light kept the dark things at bay. However, the girl had no idea that she had chanced to go out across the bog lands on the night of a blood moon. That's why they call it when there's no total eclipse of the moon. The moon passes behind the earth and its light is blotted out, leaving just a red glow in the sky where the moon should be. And so it came to pass that when the girl was only halfway across the bogs, the moon faded out and the blood moon appeared, and she was plunged into darkness. Before her, all was dark but for the glimmer of the stars in the black pools and reddish glow of that bloody moon. The girl drew her cloak tight about her and trembled. She was afraid to go forward, but she couldn't go back, being unable to see her way in the darkness. So onwards she went, stepping as lightly as she could from the tuft to tuft, picking her way between greedy, gurgling water holes. She couldn't see where she was, or where the path was, or how she could get out of the marsh. And as she walked, the evil things began to emerge out of their hiding places. The frightened girl looked about her, and she saw nothing but shifting, flurrying evil things coming and going here and there, busy with their own ill work. Then the dead folk rose in the water and stared at her with white, twisted faces and hellfire in their empty eye holes. And the slimy, dripping dead bands slithered about, beckoning and pointing and making her skin crawl with their cold, wet feet. And all around about her the grinning ghouls and the dead folk and the creeping horrors crawled and crowded. Their voices mocked her, and the dead hands plucked at her in the head. The willow, the wisps, the dangled lanterns, and shook with evil glee as they led her further and further from the right path, and closer to the deep holes and the deadly quicks. Shaking with fear and loathing for the things about her, she struggled on towards the flickering lights that looked like help and safety. Just as the girl came near a big black pool, her foot slipped and she almost tumbled in. She grabbed with both hands at a black snag nearby to steady herself. But as soon as she touched it, the snag twined itself around her wrists like a pair of handcuffs and gripped her so tight that she couldn't move. She pulled and twisted and fought, but it was no good. She was stuck fast, and she couldn't get free. So she looked about her fearfully and wondered if help would ever come. The poor girl stood trembling in the dark. She called and called for help, and then her voice died away with a sob. She began again with a screech of fear and called until the marshes were full of her pitiful crying voice. "Help," she shrieked. "I'm caught in the boglands. Can anyone hear me? God and Mary, save me from the horrors." And then she'd stop and sob and moan and call on all the angels and saints and God Himself to fetch her out. And then she'd break out into a shriek again as the slimy, slithery things crawled over her face until she couldn't even see the false lights in front of her. And then, as if it wasn't bad enough already, the horrors would take all the sorts of shapes, and handsome boys would peek at her with bright eyes and stretch out soft, helping hands. But when she'd try to catch hold of them, they'd change in her grip to slimy things, and shapeless worms and wicked voices would mock her with foul glee. And all the evil things came and whispered in her ears, and danced about and shouted out the secret things of her own heart until she shrieked and sobbed with shame. And the horrors crawled and gibbered round about and mocked her some more. Then she heard footsteps floundering around, squishing in the muck and slipping on the tufts. And through the darkness she saw a white face, wild staring eyes. It was a man who lived on the bogs, an evil and depraved man who went out every night looking for young girls, hoping they might stray off the path and fall into his sweaty clutches. And when the poor girl saw that he was coming nearer and nearer, she was so mad with terror that she struggled and fought and pulled harder than ever, but she couldn't get loose, no matter how she twisted, no matter how she turned. When the man laid eyes on her, he was overcome by a strange desire and dark thought. A strange fear overcame her. At the foot of the black snag, as she lay there gasping for breath, the man clutched her in his hairy hands and got on top of her. With a screech and howl, the evil things came crowding around her, mocking and snatching and beating, shrieking with rage and spite, and swearing with foul tongues, spitting and snarling, and that poor girl crouched trembling and sick in the mud and wondered when they'd make an end of her. The dead folk moaned and the evil things howled until the very tufts of the grass shook and the squishy earth mounds pulsed and the black water gurgled. And then it began. Hurt her, hurt her, shrieked the creeping terrors as they tore at her clothes. The evil things howled again. Smother her, smother her, whispered the crawling horrors as they twined themselves around her knees. The evil things howled again. Strangle her, strangle her, screeched the dead folk as they plucked at her throat with cold, bony fingers. The evil things howled again. Bury her, bury her, screamed the ghosts and the ghouls as they writhed and grind about her and chuckled to themselves. They all shouted with spite and ill will as they fought and squabbled about what they should do with her, and the poor girl lay there on the ground and wished she was dead and done with. As a pale grey light began to come, the sky and the dawn drew close. The evil man caught hold of her. With horrid, bony fingers, he squeezed the life out of her. And then, as the morning came and the grey light grew brighter in the sky, the shapeless things fled away to seek the dark corners, and the dead folk crept back into the water, or crammed themselves back into their coffins. And the man went home, and the black, slimy water shone in the dawn's light, as if no evil things were ever come near it. And there lay the poor girl, dead and buried in the bog, until someone would come to take her home, but who would ever know where to look for her? Well, the next day, the girl's parents grew tired of waiting for her to come home. They went out and searched the town, but there was no sign of her. The news spread fast, and soon everybody in town was talking about the missing girl. Their tongues wagged at home and at the inn, and in the garth, but nobody knew what happened to her. When night came, the people waited and waited, but the moon never appeared. The night was as dark as could be, and the evil things were worse than ever. It wasn't safe to travel outside at night, because the bogarts creeped and wailed around the houses and peeked in at the windows, and snapped at the latches until the poor people had to keep all their lights on at night, or else the horrors would have burst through their doors. It seemed like all the ghosts and ghoulish things had lost their fear. They howled and laughed and screeched around, fit to wake the dead themselves. And the townsfolk sat, trembling and shaking by the fire, and could not sleep nor rest, nor put a foot outside their homes, all through the dark and dreary night. And as the days went on, there was still no sign of the missing girl, and the moon still never came back. Naturally, the poor folk were strangely feared and amazed by this, and a lot of them went to consult a wise woman who dwelt in the old mill, and asked her if she could find out why the moon had disappeared. "Well," she said after looking in the brew pot, and in the mirror and the book, "it's very queer, but I can't rightly tell what's happened to her. If you hear of anything, come and tell me. Anyways, put a pinch of salt, a straw and a button on the doorstep of your house at night, and the horrors will not be able to come in." So then the girl's parents went to their missing daughter and asked if they should find her. The wise woman looked long in the pot and the book again, and then she nodded her head. "It's dark still, childer, dark," she said. "I can't rightly see, but do as I tell you and you'll find out for yourselves. Take every man and woman in town, and just before the night gathers, put a stone in your mouths and take a hazel twig in your hands, and say never a word to each other till you're safe home again. Walk on and fear not, far into the midst of the mush, till you find a coffin, a candle, and a cross. Then you'll not be far from your daughter. Look, and it may happen that you'll find her." So when the next night came in the darklings, the townsfolk gathered by the edge of the bog. They all went out together, every man and woman in the town, with the girl's parents leading the way. Each of them had stone in their mouths and a hazel twig in their hands, and they were all feeling, as you might imagine, very afeared and creepy. They stumbled and started along the path that led into the midst of their herd, the sidings and fluttering in their ears, and felt cold wet fingers touch them, but they kept their hands and heads, and on they went, looking all about them for any sign of a coffin, a candle, and a cross. They came to a black pool of water beside a great big snag, and all at once they stopped, quaking and amazed and scared, for there was a great big stone, lying half in and half out of the water, looking for all the world like a strange grey coffin. And at the head of it there was a black snag, stretching out its two arms as if it were a dark, gruesome cross. And on top of it a tiny light flickered, just like a dying candle. They all knelt down in the muck and crossed themselves as and said, "Our Lord," first forward because of the cross, and then backward to keep off the boggles, but without speaking out loud, for they knew that the evil things would catch them if they didn't do as the wise woman told them. Then they took hold of the big stone and shoved it out the way, and they saw a strange and beautiful face looking up at them from out of the black water. It was the face of the missing girl. Suddenly, a light came so quick and so white and shining that they stepped back in amazement. With that, a grey, angry wail came from the fleeing horrors, and the very next minute, when they could see again, the darkness and the evil things clan away. So parents and the townsfolk went home carrying the dead girl's body between them. Their hearts were heavy, but they were glad they had finally found her. The next day they gave her a decent Christian burial in the village cemetery, and ever since, the moon shines brighter and clearer over the bogs than ever before. I know this story is true. Mark my words, because my grandmother herself saw the snag with its two arms, looking for all the world like a great cross, and the black, slimy water at its foot where the poor girl was dead and buried in the bog and the stone nearby that kept her down, while the townsfolk sought her and found her and set her loose and put the moon back in the sky again.